So today I'm just going to be texturing a sci-fi floor tile using Photoshop. But the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a metal base texture for us to use later. Now this is a really common thing to do. It just kind of underlays underneath everything. It's what you really build off of. I usually start mine off by just filling a layer with flat gray and then taking grunge brushes and just overlaying them on top really slowly. You gotta really take care with doing this and do it really minimally to make sure that it's not over grunged and doesn't end up looking like stone in the end result. So I've started off here by just taking any random grunge brush out of my collection, and then I put it on a new layer and then applied a mask to it, which is down in the layers palette, and I've masked it off so it's less opaque in certain sections than others. So I'm just going to do it again with another new layer and another grunge brush. So usually what I do is I take the same grunge brush and just paint black on the mask to start removing the grunge from that layer in only certain sections. So now, as you can see, I've really toned the opacity down loads, and this prevents from making it too intense and such that it will be overwhelming in the final product. So now I'm just going to do the same thing, but with a white grunge brush that's different instead of being the one we previously used to get some variation in there. I think it's very important to add different tones into your base texture, so when it comes time to use this on your model, you have some variation in there, and it's not just all dark tones or all bright white tones that you've added. And it really gives it some sort of contrast in the end. So now that I've done that, I'm just going to use a brightness contrast adjustment layer, which is right next to the layer mask tool down there on the layers palette. And I'm just going to adjust it to change my brightness level a little bit. And I just wanted to bring it down and to contrast it down a notch. So now what I'm going to do, I'm taking this random scrape brush, which I have in my collection, and I'm just going to kind of place it gently on here. I'm going to space it out. I can't just layer it on there real thick or else it'll get terrible real quickly. So now I'm just going to use the same exact layer mask technique to remove the grunge from the layer, mask it off in spots so it's not too intense. So now I also just changed the layer blending style to overlay to kind of remove some of the intensity that's on here and to help it react in a different kind of way. So now what I'm doing is I'm selecting this brush that I really like. It has a lot of very pixely detail that really helps your scratches be varied, and it just wears them off in a specific way that makes it look really nice and not even at all. Now that's one real big thing about scratches, is that they've got to look very dynamic. They can't just be on or off. They've got to be varied opacities and whatnot to really sell them as being real. So now what I'm just doing here is I'm just going to kind of check out the layers, see what they do now that I've changed a blending mode. So now what I'm going to do here, following that, is I'm going to make yet another layer. And this has just some kind of scratches that are spaced out evenly and not really all over the place. They're not very dense, is a good way to put it. So now I'm just using the same mask technique to kind of remove some of the density of this brush, which had more scratches than I kind of wanted. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use brightness contrast on the mask itself to kind of decontrast the mask and make it show a little bit more of the scratches in some areas than others, and kind of evenly all around, not just to certain portions of the mask. So now I'm just kind of doing a little trick here just to get more white scrapes with that same kind of brush and the same kind of mask effects that I want, by simply taking the same exact layer, duplicating it, and then flipping it or rotating it 180 degrees, and then inverting the color, which I'm doing right here, to make it white instead of black scrapes, and then changing the blending mode to something like overlay. And now I'm playing with the mask, so as you can see here, we've got now white scrapes with the same brush and the same everything that we just made. However, these are white and they're upside down rather than being the way we place them. So now I'm just selecting a brush here that I'm going to use to apply on the mask with a black paint to remove some really dense areas of the brush, but just some areas. Now, it might be a good idea to do this with a low opacity so it doesn't get too out of control and so you don't just have on or off basically. So now again, just kind of checking everything over and over, turning on and off the layer, playing with opacities, doing whatever I can to make this look good. All the final opacity tweaks, however, will come at the end of making this actual base itself. So now I'm just going to start adjusting a couple levels, and I believe we're going to call it done. You could choose to make this a tiling pattern as well using offset, but I won't cover that right now as it's not that important. Alright, so now we're going to move on to the next part of the tutorial, which is going to cover creating an edge scrapes brush. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the brushes palette. I'm going to hit that arrow up in the corner. I'm going to say load brushes, and I'm going to select and open the square brushes file, which is included with Photoshop. Now as you can see, it's going to load multiple sizes of square brushes, and it's going to place them into your brushes palette. So as you could have seen there, it kind of looks just like a square brush. It doesn't really do a lot for you. So what we need to do is we need to go into the brush option palette, which is up in the tabs up at the top. It might be different in CS3 and CS4. This is CS2. However, we're not going to worry about that right now. First off, I've checked off noise, and I've checked off other dynamics, and I've changed the opacity jitter way up, so that's kind of uneven. So now what I've also done is I've gone to shape dynamics, and I've changed the angle jitter. Now what I'm doing here is I'm going to the scattering, which is making it scatter all over the place and making it look uneven. It's also good to go back into the shape dynamics and do the size jitter, and that'll really help it look dynamic and have some variation. So now we can save this as a new brush preset by going to that arrow again and saying new brush preset. That will allow us to save it for use later in other projects. Now I'm just going to load up one that I have already pre-made, which is something I use daily in my work, and it definitely helps. It's a little bit sharper and harder, as you might notice, than the one we've made, but with some tweaking, I'm sure you'll get it just as good. Alright, so it's time to texture that sci-fi floor tile that I promised we'd do. So as you can see, I've already blocked out some colors, and that'll really help you get started and actually visualize what you're doing. Now I've also got a lighting group which has a bunch of other miscellaneous stuff that might be helpful in the future when working on this project. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift drag the ambient occlusion map onto here and put it in the lighting group. This ambient occlusion, when set to multiply on the blending style, will really help make this entire floor tile pop out at you. So here's a little trick that I learned when running your normal map through the XNormal normals to cavity filter. You can change the method to EMB and play with the Y setting to really highlight these edges. Once you have this result, you run it through the brightness contrast and really contrast it up until there's only white lines. And then once you're done with that, you can set to screen and watch those edges come forward. Now once you've gone through the brightness contrast and made sure so that it's only white lines showing, it's good to blur it and then put it on screen. And on the diffuse, it really should not be very visible at all. However, you'll see that this comes in handy later, especially when making the specular map. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new group, which is down right there next to the adjustment fill layers, and we're going to rename it metal. Now this is going to contain our pattern fill layer, which has our base texture on it. Now you can make a pattern fill with the base texture by opening up your base texture PSD and then going to edit and then create new pattern fill. And then you'll be able to create a new pattern fill layer and drag around your base texture non-destructively whenever you want. So now metal is in monochrome, right? We got to add some color to this. So right click on your layer with the metal base, go to blending options and go to color overlay. Make it a blue and change it to soft light, and you'll notice that this base texture is going to be a little bit less boring. You just got to make sure that the color is very slight. So now I'm just going to very quickly render it out in 3D Studio Max. Now that doesn't look too bad, but it looks very flat, and it really needs some extra details to make it actually look like it's a real item. So now I'm going to start off by making some dirt, and this is going to be done by taking the ambient occlusion, going to hue saturation, setting it to colorize. Now this is CS2, I don't know about CS3 or anything else, but change the hue and the saturation so it looks kind of orangey. So now what I'm doing is I'm using the blend if arrows on the layer style options here to kind of make it only show those orange bits that we colorized. You can split apart those little arrows on the blend if boxes by holding down Alt and dragging them left to right. So now I'm going to just change the blending mode to screen or something different. Normal is usually really good for this actually, and putting it to a very low opacity. Low enough to be kind of minor, but it should be loud enough that it's visible. So now I'm going to add a layer mask and start masking it off and making it look like dirt. So this is just a very quick method to help you kind of get started and get some sort of initial visual interest. And it might really help get some dirt into those areas that might have some dirt in them in real life. So this dirt really has to be noticeable, but it's got to be kind of subtle as well. It's a very delicate balance that might take a while to achieve properly. However, once you figure out that delicate balance, it really is a nice trick that will help dirty up your models very quickly. So now I'm just going to adjust the hue and saturation to change it so it's a little bit more red. Now, red, kind of like a clay, almost sells dirt more in CG, I find, than it would in real life. And I'm going to Gaussian blur the actual ambient occlusion that we colorized and made orange, and that'll help make it look nice for now. I'm going to sharpen up the mask and use brightness contrast a little bit on it to help it get a little bit more even, because I might have adjusted the mask too much. So now I'm going to use some grunge brushes to go back over it, and now I'm just sampling areas that I think look nice on the mask. Now, I'm taking quite a bit of time here to develop this mask into something that I quite like, but in the long run, that's probably a good thing. So while I fix this area of dirt that I don't quite like, I think I should explain a little bit more about placing grunge into your model. Models can look very worn down with just a couple of well-placed scrapes, and as I previously noted, your grunge should be minimal but effective. And because when you pile on grunge everywhere, your texture just starts to get really messy looking. And to make something that worn down in real life, I really couldn't imagine what it would have to go through to get that way. You really need to have some breaks and variation to keep it looking smooth and lifelike. And I think that's the key to making metal, is just keep it smooth, because far more often than not, metal is smooth in real life and not bumpy. And I think that's a big problem that I see a lot on textures for metal objects, is that they tend to come out looking like stone, and that's not good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate that edge highlight layer that we made using the XNormal normal map to cavity map filter, and I'm going to put it into the metal group right above the base texture layer. Then I'm going to put it through this Photoshop action, which I pre-made, that automatically resets the palette colors and then puts it through the filters called Torn Edges and Spatter. And this creates some really nice automated edge scrapes, and they can be used to quickly add these edge scrapes to items that might have taken a long time to hand paint the scrapes onto otherwise. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a mask to our scrapes layer, and we're going to take that scrapes brush that we made earlier, and we're going to remove some of these parts that we don't want from the mask. And I'm just going to do 1 or 2 sections of this real quick, and then we can skip on to the next section, because you don't need to see me do the entire object. Alright, so now we scraped off all that we need to from our automated edge scrapes layer, and we're just going to fix up a couple things like removing the edge scrapes from those diamond plate treads, since that got picked up all automatically as well. So what I did there was I rendered out just to see what it looked like, and as you can see, it's not over the top grunged, but it still has some wear and tear that makes it look pretty used as it would in real life. So now what I'm doing here is I'm duplicating the metal base layer, and I'm going to rasterize one of them since they're pattern fill layers. I renamed one of them to specular metal and one of them to diffuse metal. The diffuse metal one is the one we're going to be using for the diffuse map. Now that's basically just a base texture that's really decontrasted to keep everything looking very smooth. And the specular metal layer will only be used on the specular texture, which we're going to make at the end of this video. So now I'm just going over the edge scrapes again, the automated ones that we created, and I'm just going over with an even lower opacity scrape brush just to make it kind of look even more varied and more dynamic, rather than just being kind of a more on and off type scrape. Kind of help it give it some more texture to it instead of just being on or off. And once we've done that, I'm just going to go and take the paint layers that we've created here and remove the edge scrapes from them, because we've got a special kind of grunge just for those. So now that we've removed the scrapes from the paint layers and also from around some areas of the screws where it's a bit too heavy, we can start grunging up the paint itself, and that's a really fun process to do. So I did the paint using a color fill layer, which is another one of those adjustment layers. And since it automatically has a mask for it, it's ideal. It's very quick. And this was just colors that was placed where I thought it should be on the design. So now on that mask, I'm taking that scrapes brush that we previously made, and I'm painting some black at, say, 70% opacity. And as you can see, this is getting this really nice look, and it does look pretty convincing. Now, so as with any kind of damage, you want to kind of scrape off stuff that would get commonly used. So, for example, corners would commonly get banged up a lot. Flat surfaces, not so much, but corners tend to. Also around screw holes and doors, access panels, anything that would get commonly used on a day-to-day basis. Now, as a real-world example, the trigger on a gun or the grips or stuff that would be poking out, such as corners, would get grunged up more than, say, recessed areas or large flat areas. However, you should try and balance that all out to make it look interesting yet realistic. So now that I've gone and done that quick section, I'm just going to repeat all that kind of technique throughout the entire paint layer. And now once we've rendered out, you can see it looks a lot nicer and a lot dirtier. And for my next little trick, I'm just going to control click on the mask of our paint layer, the orange paint, and that'll create a selection of it. Now what I'm going to do is make a new layer, and I'm just going to paint some random black grunge brushes on them. And I'm going to set it to saturation. Now this adds this very kind of subtle, minor detail to the paint that definitely helps sell it as being real paint. So now it's time to add a bit of random scrapes on a new layer set to overlay. Now this is basically the same technique that I use when creating the base texture, except it's uniquely added to the entire texture where only needed. So all these small scrapes are just there to break up the large flat surfaces that would otherwise be very boring to look at. So now I've added a mask to the random scrapes layer, and I'm just using the same scrapes brush to paint black on the mask and remove some of the dense scrapes that were added. The random scrapes should only be on the large flat surfaces and should really end up being very subtle. If you do it too much, it'll really just look overdone and messy. Now I picked out that brush that I mentioned I really liked during the base texture creation part of the video, and I'm using it now to remove these random scrapes, and it does get this nice sharp pixelated look to the scrapes that you wouldn't get when using just your standard old grunge brush. I'm just going to quickly render this out, see how it looks. Quite happy with it so far. And now I think what I'm going to do is add some random color into the texture. Now color is definitely something that sells metal or any object more than anything. Definitely helps catch the eye, get some variation into it. As you can see, that layer, that pattern, has a lot of just random colors, totally random. Now I suggest that you make your own pattern, because that one's not great. But it does the job, gets some kind of variation to the texture, and just kind of makes it pop a little bit more. So now I'm just going to play with the dirt layer. I'm going to change the opacities around, make it a little bit more subtle and less pronounced, because before it may have been too much and it was overwhelming the AO. So now I've also duplicated the AO to try and give the shadows some more depth and make the texture really stand out. So I'm just going to take a moment here to save, render it out, see how it looks in its current form. And then I'm going to get ready here to paint on some unique scrapes, some stuff with that scrape brush that we made earlier, and we've really used quite a bit. That brush is really handy because, as you can see, when painting on just white onto a new layer, it does make some nice thick scrapes, and it really helps add to your automated ones that you made earlier. So now I'm going to paint on some scrapes on areas that I think it would get more beaten up. Big edges, corners, sharp pointy bits, as well as some areas that I think just need some more visual interest. So now I'm just going to throw some scrapes on areas that would be commonly beat up, some of these large edges, some of these corners, stuff that I've already mentioned pretty much, as well as just some areas that I think need visual interest. And use your own judgment when doing that, because you don't want to just put scrapes everywhere, that's for sure, but you also don't want to make it too boring everywhere. You want to add some kind of interest. So I've just put the layer style to overlay, and I've added a mask. I'm just going to use the same brush to scrape off stuff with an opacity of around 70, as I've usually used, and just kind of scrape everything off using a black paint on the mask. And this really gives some nice variation, nice kind of details, and just makes them less black and white on or off, and has more variation, as I've said. So I'm just going to go around and do this to all the scrapes that we just added, and once we render it out, you'll really see how different it does look. I'm also going to go decontrast the base texture, because now that we've got all this other visual interest onto our texture, we really don't need the base texture as much anymore on the diffuse. I'm also going to add this kind of blobby layer. This is just a bunch of pre-made black blobs that's just on a generic flat texture that I made a while ago. And this helps add an oily kind of look, especially when you add it on the specular, and on the specular only. But when I add it on the diffuse, it does help quite a bit as well. You just gotta make sure that this, as with most everything, is added on relatively subtly. So now I'm just gonna save it, quickly render it out, see how it looks. I like it so far. We're gonna add the specular later, but I'm just gonna do Control A, then a Control Shift C, and then a Control V. And what that does is that copies merged and then pastes it on a new layer. Then I sharpen that layer, put it on the top, and it gives a little bit of sharpening to the entire thing. I'm just going to save out now a new PSD called Specular, and it's just the same as the diffuse right now, but we're going to adjust levels, we're going to adjust color, and we're going to get to the point where we can use it as a specular quite well. So now I'm just going to change stuff to their logical values on the specular. For example, the dirt is going to be changed to something like multiply or color burn, because dirt is not very reflective to light, is it? It's very, very matte, so it should be very dark on the specular. And I'm just changing brightness contrast layers and stuff to reflect how this should be. The diamond plate treading I wanted to highlight more, so I brightened that area up. The paint I've darkened down, I've changed it to a blue tone, so that when it reflects light, it becomes a pure white instead of being orange. And that's something that's a really big deal, is making stuff bluer or negative tones to kind of get that pure white highlight that you want. I've also changed here the black blobs layer to a higher opacity so you can see it better and it's more contrasty. I'm also changing the scrapes layers to normal, so that it's more contrasted, definitely stands out more. You want the scrapes to really be pushed a lot, but not too much, or else they're just going to blow everything out of proportion. And as you can also see, I've bumped up the edge highlight layer so that it really highlights all the edges of your normal map. I've also put that original base texture layer back instead of the decontrasted gray that we added on the diffuse, and I've also bumped up the random color a little bit, just so it gets a little bit more highlighted when light hits it. So now I'm just going to play with some more of these levels, get the opacities the way I want them. And once I'm done creating everything on the specular, I'm just going to give it a nice unsharp mask pass like I did for the diffuse. I'm just going to copy all and then paste it all again, and then unsharp mask it. So now I've got this set up with a real-time viewport shader in 3D Studio Max, and I've got some nice cube map reflections on this. And reflections really sell metal more than anything I can think of, even more than color. So anyway, I think this is about the end of the tutorial, so thanks everybody for watching, and practice and enjoy.